I'm with Professor Leah Litman. She is the author of a fantastic book, Lawless. You need to follow her on Blue Sky and Twitter. She's also a professor of law at University of Michigan. And she's such a trooper that right before leaving for vacation, literally, she responded to my request. And I'm like, can you just do like a 12 p.m. like rant? And she's like, I just want to talk about the Supreme Court's order. And so I'm just going to press play and Professor Littman, because I know I can sense the energy that she has things she wants to get off her chest. And the framing is my framing of this, and I believe she might agree with me, is the right wing Supreme Court majority is creating its own king. And that king refers to Donald Trump. But there was a last night, a piece of news came out, folks who haven't seen, that this Supreme Court, voila, just is allowing Donald Trump to bypass Congress and not essentially, but literally dismantle the Department of Education. And the dismantling includes firing 1,400 people and just letting this extremely important institution go kaput. And then last week, we found out that the Supreme Court said, well, the president has the authority to, also shut down these other institutions. So that's just what we've seen in the past week. But this last week, or the last night's order is just profound. And I need someone to talk to. Professor Littman is here. Professor Littman, I press play on you.
Okay. Feel free to interject whenever. There's so much to say about this order. Thanks so much for having me. And honestly, thanks for talking about this. There's just like so much happening right now. I briefly skimmed to see what the news covered yesterday, and this just got drowned out, even though I think it's hugely significant. So I'll start with what the president did. So the president announced via executive order that he wanted to disband the Department of Education. Back up a step. Department of Education, department created by statute. That's Congress. Therefore, only Congress can disband an agency or a department that it has created. This is not something the president can do. So after this executive order in which the president announced he was going to disband an agency that only Congress can disband, his Secretary of Education, WWE aficionado Linda McMahon, said, I am going to fire more than half of the department's staff. That includes all of the people who are in charge of administering the bilingual education programs, bilingual language programs in schools. That includes firing everybody in the Department of Education's General Counsel's office that administers the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So part of the problem, of course, is if you fire over half of the Department of Education staff, the department can't do the things that Congress assigned them to do, like enforce, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act and a variety of other federal programs that the department administers. So, unsurprisingly, this unconstitutional effort to strip and shut down the Department of Education was challenged in the lower courts. And the lower courts concluded, again, not surprisingly, if you take out half the staff, the department can't do a bunch of the things that Congress has asked them to do. So they concluded that this effort to shut down the Department of Education was illegal. It violated federal laws that laid out specific limits on a president's ability and an agency's ability to fire people who worked there. And it violated the Constitution's separation of powers, which again, because the department is an agency created by statute, only a statute can eliminate it. So the Supreme Court just announced yesterday that actually this effort to dismantle the Department of Education can go ahead. We don't know why they concluded it can go ahead, because this order was released without announcement on the shadow docket. So the court opted not to explain itself, exercising apparently its aristocratic sovereign power just to declare the way things are. So that
Well, Professor, can I? I'm not. I don't want you to continue on your rant. But for those who don't know the shadow docket, can you explain how the shadow docket has become the vehicle of choice for the Supreme Court to rubber stamp Donald Trump? For those who don't understand.
Yeah, so the shadow docket just refers to the requests that the Supreme Court gets for emergency relief. And those requests are asking the Supreme Court to grant what's called a stay or a pause of a lower court decision, basically so that the lower court decision is treated as if it doesn't exist at all. And those requests are made for the Supreme Court to do this without full briefing, without oral argument, And when they release a decision on the shadow docket, they can opt not to release any opinion at all. And so that allows them to do these indefensible things without having to come up with a remotely plausible or implausible explanation for them
Just vibes,
allowing
baby.
Donald Trump.
Just vibes.
Exactly. Just vibes, right? The vibes are off in the lower court's ruling against Donald Trump. And as you say, this has really become the vehicle for the Supreme Court enabling Donald Trump, not only because it eliminates, their obligation to explain themselves, also because it reduces the amount of attention, right, given to this, in part because they don't explain themselves, in part because we don't know when these rulings are coming. Think back to the amount of coverage that the birthright citizenship nationwide injunction ruling got. Now compare that with this order, which again allows the president to shut down this super important agency. It's not getting anything because we didn't know it was coming and they didn't bother to explain themselves. So since April 4th, the court has ruled on 15 emergency applications from the Trump administration. Want to guess how many they have ruled for the Trump administration in?
14.
15. All of them. They've
I
run
was
the tables. They've run the tables. So truly, this has become the vehicle for the court's complicity and facilitation with the Trump administration. So I want to pause over two aspects of this ruling that I find just stunningly galling in their hypocrisy. I'm going to put to the side the fact that the court didn't bother to explain themselves. Compare and contrast this ruling with a ruling from 2 years ago, where the Republican justices said Joe Biden and Joe Biden's Department of Education could not cancel student debt relief
Yep.
because Congress, by statute, had not clearly authorized Biden and the Department of Education to grant student debt relief. Now, if you went and pored over the United States Code, I can report to you that there is zero clear authorization in any federal law for the president to shut down the Department of Education and to fire half of its staff. So this court allows Donald Trump to do things without authorization in federal law and doesn't allow Joe Biden or Democrats to do things that, in my view, were authorized by federal law. Federal law allows the Department of Education to waive or modify, right, like various federal regulations, including owing debt back to the federal government. But the Republican justices said, no, that's too big a deal. Student debt relief, that's like the French Revolution. But shutting down a federal agency isn't. So the stunning hypocrisy in what they allow Republican presidents to do compared with what they don't allow Democratic presidents to do is part of what makes this so appalling. The other part of my rant that I wanted to include was about last week's order. So last week's order pertained to this kind of umbrella executive order that Donald Trump issued, in which he and his Office of Personnel Management told all of you federal agencies, you got to submit plans to do what are called these reductions in force, this mass layoff of federal officials, and plans to restructure and reorganize your agencies. So lower courts concluded that's illegal, right? Nothing gives the president or the Office of Personnel Management the authority to fire everybody in all of these agencies. The Supreme Court last week put on hold that ruling, the ruling that had blocked the president's executive order directing all agencies to do these reductions in force. But what did the Supreme Court say? Well, you can't challenge this executive order that applies to all of the agencies, but you can challenge each individual agency's plan for a reduction in force. And you can say that any individual particular agency's plan for a reduction in force, these mass firings, is illegal. And it's like they came back this week and were like, nanny, nanny, boo, boo, psych, lols, you can't do that either. So now they are just allowing Donald Trump to basically pillage and gut the federal government without authorization in federal law. And again, without having to explain themselves about why they think this is remotely legal.
excellent rant. Thank you so much. I needed someone to say that in an intelligent fashion because, and I agree that people aren't paying attention because there's so many crises.
Yeah.
And what I've seen is this right-wing Supreme Court. When that horrific. I mean, they pretty much told you what they're going to do in last year's Supreme Court case, which was even more extreme than I imagined, that gave essentially, let's be honest, Donald Trump a get out of jail free card. And when they said that the president has absolute immunity for core functions within his office, I mean, I was like, no, it's not President Biden, it's Donald Trump. And
Right.
yeah, it's Donald Trump. They're not talking about Biden, they're talking about Trump. So Trump gets away scot-free for
Like,
essentially inciting a
if you think the next Democratic president could get away with firing all or half of DHS and ICE, right? Like, I've got a bridge to Alaska to sell you, right? That's not happening.
that's exactly what I thought of, right? Because I'm like, all right, if the president now has the ability to unilaterally dismantle a congressionally created institution, then I'm old enough, Leah, to remember that ICE didn't exist in the 20th century. ICE was created in the War on Terror, and ICE is now Donald Trump's Gestapo. So if I'm a Democratic president, I'm just going to abolish ICE. What do you think the Supreme Court is going to say, though? Suppose the Supreme
They're going
Court,
to
okay,
say that's tyranny. That's tyranny. That is a threat to the separation of powers.
okay, so this is where now it's so egregious. It's so shameless. They've revealed, like, they've taken off the hoods, the masks, they put on, like, the supervillain capes. How do they, or does it even matter? Because there used to be a sleight of hand. There used to be like a intellectual Cirque du Soleil gymnastics to at least cover the shamelessness. It's become so egregious just in the past 2 weeks. Assuming we have a country left, assuming we have democracy left, and I'm not saying that lightly, and assuming there are free and fair elections, assuming there's a non-fascist ruler in the past, and there's still an institution called the Supreme Court. Suppose a non-evil, non-fascist president uses this to actually help individuals, right? To help dismantle ICE. Can you just imagine what would be the right-wing majority's legal reasoning to defy a Democratic president as they have openly allowed this precedent to stand?
Yeah. So they would say that is a major question. So this is something I write about in my book about how the court has
Fantastic
just
book, folks.
about how this court has just like invented legal rules. And the punchline of the legal rules is Republicans get to do the things they want and Democrats can't do the things they want. Because the major questions doctrine says whenever an agency is trying to do something that's of political and economic significance, that has to be clearly authorized by statute. So that gives them wiggle room to say, oh, abolishing ICE, that's hugely politically significant, right? Because like ICE, 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 right? That's economically significant, right? And they'll probably repeat some like anti-immigrant talking point. But abolishing the Department of Education, that's all well and good, right? Because like that's something the Republicans have wanted to do. That's outlined in Project 2025. So that's not so major. That's cool. And if you think that's a joke, I mean, like, look at what they have invoked the major questions doctrine to invalidate: Biden's Clean Power Plan, student debt relief, the test and vaccination policy. And that has somehow not managed to stop Donald Trump dismantling the Department of Education, directing all agencies to basically do these massive layoffs and reductions in force. It hasn't prevented Donald Trump from doing much, if anything. It hasn't prevented him from sending people to third countries where
Yep.
they are at risk of torture and death. So major questions doctrine boils down to, again, like, can't do things that Republicans don't want you to do. And so that would be some of my guess about what they would write in their little opinion.
Yeah, and also the hypocrisy of it is that since Brown versus Board of Education, the right wing political playbook has openly said that they want to destroy the Department of Education. Well, they want to like undo the Brown versus Board, but also once the Department of Education was destroyed, this has been like a decades long plan to the point where even Betsy DeVos, who I can't believe that it's folks. Why are you surprised? Betsy DeVos, who's tried to destroy the Department of Education, was the first Secretary of Education in the first department in the first Trump administration, and then WWE, co-founder Linda McMahon also openly said that the final mission is to destroy the Department of Education. Right, so it's completely political. It's nakedly political. It's like shamelessly political. They raise funds off this. They have like meetings with the right-wing donors to destroy the Department of Education, and the Supreme Court says, "Nah, that's not political." And I just want people to really understand that we've gone to the point, folks, where this right-wing majority. This is my words. I call them right-wing political hacks and activists in black robes. And I think it's come to the point now where it's clear that they are using and abusing this privileged position to advance an extremist right-wing agenda. And this is part and parcel of the plan, where they were funded to the tune of millions and billions of dollars, where Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society has groomed many of these justices, since they were teenagers, to eventually come to this point, right? You all think I'm joking. I'm not. Decades long grooming plan, identifying the best right wing talent, elevating them, making sure that they're in these Ivy League schools, and then, putting them through the grooming sausage facility and then handpicking them. Am I wrong about this, Laura? You're the professor.
No, I mean, like, again, this is what I write about in the first chapter of my book, The Rise of the Federalist Society and Other Right-Wing Organizations. It's actually in two chapters because it's been so important to their takeover of the courts. That organization and others is part of what allows them to get to know individuals to make sure these are the kinds of people that will vote to overrule Roe versus Wade, that will go along with our expansive vision of Republicans' presidential power. It's also this alternative ecosystem in which the justices are basically constantly reminded of here's the Republican Party's views, and they receive affirmation and validation for doing the things that Republicans want them to do. So it generates, again, this like alternative set of messaging and conferences and groups for them to be socialized in and part of that keeps them on, the path that the Republican Party is marching down.
And can you, if you will, let's talk about the three liberal justices, because I have seen Justice Jackson kind of go hard in the paint in the last month. And she's almost at the point where she's at the smoking her cigarette and being like Angela Bassett and throwing it and burning the car. A classic millennial reference to Waiting to Excel for the old timers. But talk to us about Sotomayor and Justice Jackson in particular being much more vocal than and much more vocal against, without naming them, what the Supreme Court majority, the right wing majority, is doing to the institution of the Supreme Court and democracy. Because I haven't heard this type of blunt language, both in conversation and also in opinion, ever before
Yes.
in my life.
Exactly. I mean, Justice Jackson is just incredible. Maybe one of the best things, if not the best thing Joe Biden did, is appointing her to the Supreme Court. And as you say, she has really not been shy about calling out the Republican justices' hypocrisy in their decisions and how they're clearly favoring one set of interests over others and giving this administration special treatment and engaging in all sorts of procedural irregularities and maneuvers in order to do so. So she's likened them to, an emergency responder that shows up and rather than extinguishing the flames, fans the flames. She's suggested, that the court is kind of in the bag for Donald Trump. She suggested that the court is favoring corporate moneyed interest. She has suggested, I could go on and on, but the kinds of things that she says like that in her opinions are very important and empowering because if you have someone at the Supreme Court saying that kind of stuff, it's like the call is coming from inside the house. Someone up front, right, and up close is saying all of your fears and concerns. Yeah, that is really happening. And it gives a lot of affirmation and validation and credibility to, people who are also trying to sound the alarm. And that's why the right wingers are so mad at her, right? Because like she is pulling back the cover, right, and legitimacy they have found in people pretending that the justices are acting, in good faith and in compliance with the law. She and Justice Sotomayor have said the Trump administration basically has the justices up on speed dial.
Yep.
She did
Rubber stamping.
she did a fantastic dissent in this case that both of the Democratic appointees, the Department of Education case that is, that both of the Democratic appointees joined. She and Justice Jackson wrote the dissent just for herself last week in the case about the mass firings, suggesting that the court is basically abusing the shadow docket. So again, it's that kind of language that should warrant all of our attention and really cause us to focus on how the Supreme Court is very much a part of the problem in enabling, what the Trump administration is doing.
But the reality then is they don't have the numbers, right? 6-3. And Justice Thomas and Samuel Alito, but it's all six. It's all six. They're all groomed by Federalist Society. If you don't believe me, listen to Professor Litman. Go read her book, Lawless. But it's just three, right? They don't have the numbers.
Yeah.
And so are these dissents for posterity? Are these dissents to raise the alarm? Are these dissents like Paul Revere? Because the institution to me, Leah, and I've been saying this for a couple of years, and of course, I was called radical and extremist and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this Supreme Court is corrupt. These are extremist right-wing activists in black robes. For those who aren't paying attention, they're going to rubber stamp Donald Trump. Justice Roberts is no moderate. I've been saying this for years. He is not a moderate. Folks, you don't realize he'll give you Obamacare, but then he'll gut Voting Rights Act, right? He'll give you like he's like we're like beggars in Oliver Twist. We're like, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And then he dismantles democracy. What does then the country do when one of the three major branches, which is supposed to act like a check and balance, voluntarily not just bends the knee to Donald Trump, but enables his rise to be a dictator, right? If this institution is completely corrupt, which I believe it is, what can the rest of us do? Because I see Justice Jackson and Sotomayor like with these brilliant uh, legal points, intellectual points, and also lacerating language, but at the same time, Leah, they're essentially neutered. They can't do anything.
No, I mean, like, they can't do anything because they don't have the votes. I still think that Justice Jackson writing in this register is important and could serve some functions both over the short term and the long term. In the short term, I kind of think, like, look, if the Democratic political elites were going to ignore their base when the base was telling them there is a problem with the Supreme Court, you need to do something about it, maybe they won't ignore, right, the calls from Justice Jackson and Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan. Second is I do think that those dissents, again, like, give some power and amplify, critiques like yours or critiques like mine. And they make it easier, or I'm sorry, they make it harder, right, to just discredit us, right, as like crazy harpies. Not that anyone has ever called me that. They have.
No offense to harpies.
Right.
Some of our best friends are crazy harpies.
Right. So anyways, and then over the long term, I think part of the goal is, to be writing for the next generation of lawyers and leaders. This is part of what Justice Scalia said he was writing for back when he found himself in dissent often, right, during his early tenure on the court. He said, I don't care if my colleagues don't join me, right? Like, I am writing for the next generation in order to inspire, right, the conservative legal movement and right wingers to fight for the court, right, and to basically double down. And so I think that that is also partially what Justice Jackson is doing, hopefully, right, for the other side. As to what like we can do, I mean, like, part of this is always a frustrating answer, but like changing an institution like the Supreme Court, it's going to take time. It's not something that is going to be fixed, right, just in a single election. In part because like the court just isn't getting the attention that it needs in order to build a coalition and a base that actually wants the next Democratic administration to do something meaningful about the Supreme Court. So the first step, right, is going to be public information and public education, right? Send your friends, talk to your friends about what the Supreme Court is doing. Call your senators and representatives, attend primaries and town halls, and ask your representatives, like, what are your views about the Supreme Court? What do you think should be done about the lower courts and the Supreme Court? And if they don't have any ideas, or if they don't appreciate how much that institution is facilitating the Trump administration, then they should not be elected as leaders.
Yep.
So I think that it is building a base, building a coalition, and then ensuring that the next wave of Democratic leaders responds to the calls from their base.
I have you only for a couple of minutes. For those who have joined us late, I'm going to have this entire conversation up in an hour. Professor Litman is such a trooper that literally right before getting on a plane and going on a vacation with family, she's like, all right, I'll do this. Let me rant away. And I'm like, thank you for the rant. Because the framing of this is the right-wing majority of the Supreme Court is enabling and creating its own dictator. And people might think that's hyperbole. But then again, I gave you the past year. I gave you yesterday. I gave you the past week. Can you tell people about the unitary executive theory that is animating the right-wing political movement and why that's so, well, to me, it's terrifying.
Yeah. So the unitary executive theory is basically the right-wing legal movement's recipe or attempt to make legal and less threatening, like a model for autocracy, right? And the kind of autocratic takeovers that have happened in countries like Hungary or Turkey. The unitary executive theory, which again I write about in my book, is this notion that was really kind of proposed almost during the Nixon administration, and then the Reagan administration started to double down on. And what the unitary executive theory maintains is all of the executive power in the Constitution is vested in one person, the president. And that allows the president to exercise sweeping powers over the executive branch, like engaging in mass firings, right, of federal officials. But there's not just this kind of like aspect of the unitary executive theory that says the president has all of the executive power. There's also the part of the unitary executive theory that says what that executive power is. And it is a sweeping, expansive vision of all of the things the president can do. Invoking the idea of the unitary executive theory, the Trump administration has argued they can fire people in violation of federal law. They can engage in summary expulsions, right, of people to foreign prisons in El Salvador, even if Congress hasn't authorized them to do so. They have, again, invoking the unitary executive theory, said they can basically nullify a federal law, the law that restricts applications' ability to service TikTok, right? They are basically nullified that federal law based on the idea that the president has these sweeping national security powers that allow him to essentially say, you will face no consequences for violating this federal law for all eternity. So the unitary executive theory is, right, this notion that, in my view, right, the president is in effect king, because under the unitary executive theory, Congress cannot enact a bunch of laws that would constrain the president. The unitary executive theory maintains the executive's power is so expansive and so sweeping. There are these areas in which Congress cannot tell the president what to do, and they can't tell the president not to do certain things. So again, it's that idea that is behind the Trump administration's claim that they can nullify federal laws that purport to limit the president's authority to fire federal officials, that they can nullify federal laws that prohibit what social media and app companies can do vis-a-vis TikTok because the president has decided that's bad for national security. So it is, again, this legal notion that presidents, or at least Republican presidents, are above the law.
And also this the shirt that you have and also your book, No Law, Just Vibes. These people also claim shamelessly that they're originalists. And if they're originalists, and if you're not even a lawyer or a law student, you know that the founding fathers, in quotation marks, rebelled against what? Kings and
Kings.
empires. Right, no taxation without representation, and which is why we have the Constitution. And the Constitution is very clear; they have separation of powers. Right, it's very clear that you have checks and balances. And so now we're seeing the right-wing extremist agenda, where now that they've taken over the institution of the House, the Senate, and also I would say the Supreme Court, voluntarily bending the knee and neutering their own powers and checks and balances to elevate Donald Trump to be king. We're seeing it in real time, folks, and there's a legal theory behind it. There's a movement behind it. There's money behind it. Leah's written a fantastic book called Lawless. Leah, please shamelessly promote the book and shamelessly promote yourself.
So the book is called Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. And it outlines how the Republican justices are just taking the deeply unpopular, petty, spiteful, and anti-democratic talking points of the Republican Party and declaring them to be the law. We saw that happening a bunch this past term. We're seeing that as the Supreme Court enables the Trump administration to do fuck whatever they want. And so, yeah.
That's a legal term, folks. That's a legal term, by the way.
Exactly.
They teach you in law school.
The law is written for general audiences, and it provides political context and social context to the changes we are seeing in these different areas of law, so you can understand where they come from and where they might go next.
Let me ask a final question before I let you go. And I saw Glenn Kirshner. Glenn, did you join up? Let me know if you're here. After Leah leaves, I'd love to ask for you to just to say 5 minutes and respond to what she was saying. Federal prosecutor, former prosecutor, activist, good dude, Glenn. But in this current moment, where I believe the Democratic Party, well, not I believe, Democratic Party has its lowest favorability rating since 1994, and you see the majority, I'm talking about majority of people, with a desperate need for fighters, just anyone who's willing to fight. What would you, Professor Litman, as just a U.S. citizen, would like to see the Democratic Party as an opposition party, right? Because whether or not you're Democrat or not, that's what we have. What would you like them, what would you want them to say in this particular moment about this Supreme Court? What's the message that they should tell the American people about this Supreme Court, especially in light of what the Supreme Court did yesterday, giving Donald Trump a rubber stamp to dismantle the Department of Education?
The court is captured. The court is not going to save us. It's on all of us. Don't assume those weirdos are going to do it for you.
It's up to all of us to save it. Save it.
Yep.
Professor Litman, thank you so much. She's out to vacation. She joined us at the last second. Folks, we'll have this conversation up in about an hour for those who joined us late. Follow Leah Litman, buy her book, Lawless. It's fantastic. And those who joined us late, this has been The Left Hook. The entire conversation would be up without any paywalls. I'm a fool. Everything is for free on the lefthook.substack.com. If you have a few bucks, please join. I have a bunch of kids. But in the meantime, be informed, be empathetic, be kind, and please, oh please, don't be a fascist. Enjoy your vacation. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thanks.